Hello world, just David on camera once again. This is a video I've said I've wanted to do since I started my YouTube channel. This is the video I wish I could do with some real panache and professionalism. But here it is, my first go at Tropes versus Women, Damsel in Distress Part 2. And I mean virtually the entire thing, starting about 1 minute 35 seconds and following along through the video until the second to last paragraph in the transcript. And there's a few things to go over before we get there. First, why am I making this video when so many other people have already gone after the series? Well, partially because it seemed relevant to the relationship I ended. Another reason is that the rise of Anita Sarkeesian on the back of gaming media and mainstream media seems relevant to why Gamergate formed. I also view her videos as almost entirely comprised of intellectual dishonesty, and I rankle when someone says, well, I disagree with her, but she raises some good points. So I want to demonstrate exactly how much one of these videos seems comprised of not just lies, but deliberate and insidious manipulations. The video I'll be going over, I think, demonstrates this very well, with the careful use of inappropriate but emotionally charged words and implications, heating the audience so that when she turns the implications into accusations, they're easier to accept. And there's so much more than that as well. One more thing before we get to the actual video, I would like to prep the audience a little myself with some notes from Anita's master thesis, which I got from a link in Thunderfoot's own video on this topic. First, it will be useful if you know the feminist definition of the patriarchy. In the interest of self-promotion, I did make a video dedicated to explaining this definition and its implications, if you want to go and watch that sometime. So, the feminist definition of patriarchy, as defined by Alan Johnson in The Gender Knot. A society is patriarchal to the degree that it promotes male privilege by being male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. It is also organized around an obsession with control and involves one of its key aspects, the oppression of women. Now, Anita's thesis. I've read the entire thing. She examines science fiction and fantasy television series and largely describes the characters from that perspective of the patriarchy. In talking about traits she will eventually identify as masculine in strong female characters and the series that she's watched, she says, as much as I admired these traits, I realized that if they were men, I would have been bored. And other quotes from her thesis are, Lara Croft's ultimate role is to have erotic impact. Placing women in traditionally masculine roles without disrupting the traditional masculine value systems associated with them maintains male dominance. It is still not acceptable to have a situation wherein feminine qualities can be transformed as heroic characteristics. Even particular kinds of editing, shots, and staging devices are implicated in the process of making patriarchal meaning. This perpetuates the myth that women of color are not authentically beautiful. Strong women represent a patriarchal model, so strong women represent male domination and the oppression of women. Finally, let's look at this very interesting chart in her thesis. This is how she perceives modern science fiction and fantasy presentations of men and women. There are no portrayals of men with negative traits in her viewpoint. All the traits she classifies as negative, she sees as the medium painting as feminine. And the only 3 traits that are portrayed as positive feminine traits are being dependent, passive, and nurturing. The next chart is how she would paint these traits if she were in charge of the medium. I'm almost amazed that there are positive masculine traits in there. Her split of the traits is insightful, and I would normally call attention to the fact that these traits are divided by gender. This seems like it would represent a gender binary. However, in her own thesis, Anita mentions gender binary, if I recall, about 3 times, although only twice in her own words. Although in the real world, men and women are more complex than a simple binary of gendered traits, television characters tend to be more static and traditional. And Buffy and Janeway are 2 examples that begin to transcend some of the rigidity of the stereotypical gender binary, and they also begin to promote a feminist character framework. While I find that sentence questionable, given the lack of context in gender binary, I'm going to have to give her the benefit of the doubt and assume that she meant the gender binary in media and not a gender binary in real life. I wanted to touch on these to give an idea of the way the woman who created these videos thinks, so we can be aware of how her opinions will color what she makes. So let us finally get started.
As a trope, the damsel in distress is a plot device in which a female character is placed in a perilous situation from which she cannot escape on her own and then must be rescued by a male character, usually providing an incentive or motivation for the protagonist's quest. Now, it might be tempting to think that the damsel in distress was just a product of its time, and that by now surely the trope must be a thing of the past. Well, while we have seen a moderate increase in the number of playable female characters, the plot device hasn't gone away. In fact, the damsel in distress has seen a bit of a resurgence in recent years.
A tempting thought? Well, no. If you don't think there's anything wrong with the trope, then you have no reason to think it isn't being used. And without evidence of tropes being harmful to women, there's no reason to think this. Quite frankly, if you have broad exposure to modern media, you know these tropes are still being used. Saying that you would think they aren't is merely a device to make the revelation that they are being used feel more powerful. Sure, it's a common trick for any presentation to use, but given what's still to come, I will point out this almost unnoteworthy and common conversational trick.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Suffice it to say, the trope is alive and well even today. And since the majority of these titles still focus on delivering crude, unsophisticated male power fantasies, developers are largely unwilling to give up the damsel in distress as an easy default motivation for their brooding male heroes or anti-heroes. Remember that as a trope, the damsel in distress is a plot device used by writers, and not necessarily always just a one-dimensional character type entirely defined by victimhood.
For critical analysis, there are a lot of value judgments in here. I'll note the terms crude and unsophisticated. I'd also like to note that if you look largely at the AAA game industry, which Anita seems to be doing here, you get a very different result than if you include the incredible number of indie titles released in the year, much less the casual games like hidden object adventures and mystery adventures. I cannot find an easy number of these games released in a year versus AAA titles, but there are no small number of them, and they do not conform to these stereotypes. Also, stories need plot devices, and Anita's concession of this is immediately followed by denying the well-realized character's agency in the face of these tropes as an excuse in just a few moments.
Now and then, damseled characters may be well-written, funny, dynamic, or likable.
I'm just trying to set you on fire through this stupid hat!
What a delightfully mean little brain you have.
However, this extra character development tends to make their eventual disempowerment all the more frustrating. Damsels on the more sassy end of the spectrum may struggle with their captors, or even attempt an escape on their own, but inevitably their efforts always prove futile. Occasionally they may be allowed to offer the hero a last-minute helping hand, or to kick the bad guy while he's down, but these moments are largely symbolic and typically only happen after the core adventure is over or the danger has passed. These token gestures of pseudo-empowerment don't really offer any meaningful change to the core of the trope, and it feels like developers just throw these moments in the last minute to try and excuse their continued reliance on the damsel in distress.
This is a patently false statement. The efforts of escape by captured women does not inevitably prove futile. TV Tropes has a page dedicated to the damsel out of distress trope and mentions, among other things, the Monkey Island series, Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy VII, 2 instances in Final Fantasy VI, 3 Fire Emblem games, Knights of the Old Republic, 2 instances in Kingdom Hearts 2, Personas 3 and 4, 2 instances in World of Warcraft, and more. Many of these games have the women kicking the bad guy's ass in very practical and effective ways as more than just a symbol at the end of the game. These instances are not token gestures of pseudo-empowerment, nor are they meant to be.
Periodically, game developers may attempt to build a more fleshed-out relationship or emotional bond between the damseled character and the male protagonist. In the most decidedly patronizing examples, depictions of female vulnerability are used as an easy way for writers to trigger an emotional reaction in male players.
This is an instance of deliberately focusing on the female when the topic at hand can be equally applied to men as well. This type of focus either stupidly ignores or implicitly condones the impact of applying the topic to men as well. As to protecting the weak being patronizing, not inherently, no. In fact, the bully hunter trope is commonly used to have a guy protect another guy or a girl protect another girl, especially in high school films. One thing about storytelling is that you have to work within constraints, including time constraints, and an audience to keep engaged. There are times when you need to use an easy and established piece of storytelling to encapsulate some aspect of the stories or the characters. This does not make using these tropes in any way bad.
As we discussed in our first episode, when female characters are damseled, their ostensible agency is removed and they're reduced to a state of victimhood. So narratives that frame intimacy, love, or romance as something that blossoms from or hinges upon the disempowerment and victimization of women are extremely troubling because they tend to reinforce the widespread regressive notion that women in vulnerable, passive, or subordinate positions are somehow desirable because of their powerlessness. Unfortunately, these types of stories also help to perpetuate the paternalistic belief that power imbalances within romantic relationships are appealing, expected, or normal.
This statement is baseless assertion, and one should not accept it at face value just because it's been said. I say that most men find passive women to be uninteresting, and that's strictly passive, and that an interest in helping someone vulnerable is natural. And it is possible to be attracted to someone who is vulnerable without it being a character indictment. She also applies extra meaning to paternalism here by using the word appealing. Paternalism, according to Merriam-Webster, is the attitude or actions of a person, organization, etc. that protects people and gives them what they need, but does not give them any responsibility or freedom of choice, and does not imply that this impacts appeal or romantic relationships.
Okay, so we know that the damsel in distress is alive and well in gaming, but that's not the full picture. There's an even more insidious side to the story. Over the past decade, game companies have been desperately searching for ways to stand out in a market increasingly oversaturated with very similar products. As a consequence, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of games attempting to cut through the clutter by being as dark and edgy as possible.
Let us note that in an industry that is releasing more games, they will likely be releasing more games of every type. And again, if you look only at the AAA releases, you will see publishers focusing only on the elements that they know to be a part of the highest selling video games. This, again, completely ignores the large numbers of non-AAA games that do not conform to these tactics.
So we've seen developers try to spice up the damsel in distress cliché by combining it with other tropes that involve victimized women. I've identified a few of the most common of these trope cocktails, which join together multiple regressive or negative representations of women, including the disposable woman, the mercy killing, and the woman in the refrigerator.
Once again, Anita makes more unfounded assertions. If you are not a gender feminist, then you probably do not agree with the idea that the depictions of these tropes involving women are inherently regressive or negative. And she gives no evidence of this, just her own opinion stated as fact.
The term women in refrigerators was coined in the late 1990s by comic book writer Gail Simone to describe the trend of female comic book characters who are routinely brutalized or killed off as a plot device designed to move the male character's story arc forward. The trope name comes from Green Lantern issue number 54, in which the superhero returns home to find his girlfriend murdered and stuffed inside his refrigerator. This trading of female characters' lives for something meant to resemble male character development is of course part of a long media tradition, but the gruesome death of women for shock value is especially prevalent in modern gaming. The women in refrigerator trope is used as the cornerstone of some of the most famous contemporary video games. It provides the core motivational hook behind both the Max Payne and the God of War series, for example.
Here we have two different issues. One is actually fair. The women in refrigerators trope is often badly used, especially in comic books in the 90s and similar eras. The separate issue is the gendering of gruesome deaths for shock value. It is a cheaply used way to create shock. This, however, applies to both genders. Again, we can turn to TV tropes for plenty of examples outside of the general violence of killing men in a large number of action titles. In Silent Hill 4, Walter Sullivan slits his own throat and many of his victims die in various gruesome ways, including being burned alive and electrocuted. No More Heroes features an incredible number of gruesome deaths in the cutscenes. Mortal Kombat fatalities, of course. Fear apparently lives by this trope. This can happen to Inspector Cabanela in The Ghost Trick. In Max Payne 3, Marcelo is choked to death by his own necklace instead of killed in the general gun violence in the games. And not to mention the ways a large myriad of adventure games will kill the player character as a bad end, have a huge share of grisly deaths. Exploiting horrible deaths for shock value is a long-standing device in virtually any form of fiction aimed at adults, and sometimes even in fiction aimed at children. To say this is explicitly about women is either myopic or willfully misleading.
In each case, the protagonist's wife and daughter are brutally murdered, and their deaths are then used by the developers as a pretext for their inevitable bloody revenge quest. It's interesting to note that the reverse scenario, games hinging on a woman vowing revenge for her murdered boyfriend or husband, are practically non-existent. The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd. Which is one of the reasons why the scene from Disney's Wreck-It Ralph is so humorous.
First, let's note some of the games that do use this trope for women, which is called Roaring Rampage of Revenge. Heavenly Sword, House of the Dead Overkill, Liara from Mass Effect, arguably Samus from Metroid, Mushimi-sama. At this point, I'm going to say something that should be obvious. Gamers, the people who support multi-million copy sales of video games for the AAA industry, the majority of these gamers are male. The majority of games made for them feature male protagonists. Any trope you pick involving the main character of a video game will have more numbers of male characters than female characters. This is not remotely a sound way to judge if a trope applies more to men or women, because you cannot adequately compare the two in numbers.
I could do a very long video just exploring this one trope in gaming, but today I want to look at how the woman in Refrigerator is connected to the damsel in distress, and specifically the ways game developers have found to combine these two plot devices. One popular variation is to simply use both tropes in the same plotline, so as to have the male protagonist's wife stuffed in the fridge while his daughter is damseled. It's no coincidence that the fridge plot device and the damsel plot device work in much the same way. Both involve female characters who have been reduced to complete states of powerlessness by the narrative, one via kidnapping, the other via murder. The two plot devices used together then allow developers to exploit both the revenge motivation and the good old-fashioned save-the-girl motivation.
Alright, I contest that the fridge plot device and the damsel plot device work in the same way, except that they both provide motivation. This false comparison serves to make the damsel in distress trope look worse. Revenge and rescue are such different things that comparing them is either dishonest or delusional. I almost feel like explaining why they are two different things, but I suspect that if I need to, you aren't going to listen to what I say anyways.
Believe it or not, there is another more insidious version of this particular trope hybrid, which I call the damsel in the refrigerator. Now, you may be asking yourself, how can a fridged woman still be in distress? Since by definition, being fridged usually sort of requires being dead. Well, here's how it works. The damsel in the refrigerator occurs when the hero's sweetheart is brutally murdered, and her soul is then trapped or abducted by the villain. This oh-so-dark and edgy twist provides players with a double dose of female disempowerment, and allows developers to again exploit both the revenge motivation and the saving the damsel motivation, but this time with the same woman at the same time.
Anita has a category here that I actually can't find on TV tropes. Although given her disregard for finding other existing tropes, I'm going to put this down to a happy accidents for her. And a more fitting name would drop refrigerator and include soul or hell in it. However, I'll bet she is loath to let go of such an evocative term in favor of being appropriate. The only other thing I can say is she is gendering a trope that isn't specifically about women. There is no denying this trope is using both revenge and rescue at the same time, though.
This trope combination can be traced back to old-school side-scrollers like Splatterhouse 2 and Ghouls and Ghosts, but the damsel in the refrigerator has definitely become a more popular trend in recent years. The damsel in the refrigerator is part of a larger trend of throwing women under the bus in increasingly gruesome ways, in an apparent attempt to interject what I'll loosely refer to as mature themes. Developers must be hoping that by exploiting sensationalized images of brutalized women, it'll be enough to fool gamers into thinking that their games are becoming more emotionally sophisticated. But the truth is, there's nothing mature about most of these stories, and many of them cross the line into blatant misogyny.
As I've said a few times already, gendering. Games have been throwing more gruesome deaths at everyone, every gender, for shock value, and honestly, men more than women. And I'll note that it feels worse to see something bad happen to a woman than a man. You want to make sure something is going to hit someone emotionally as hard as possible, then using a man as your target isn't going to have as powerful of an impact. However, one of the things to note here is the statement that developers are hoping to fool gamers. This is an accusation of the developers deliberately choosing to do something and deliberately doing them to women. I'll be calling back to this later. Finally, we have an unfounded accusation of woman-hating. Misogyny means the hatred of women, so let's use the definition of the word and not the word. But the truth is, there is nothing mature about most of these stories, and many of them cross the line into the blatant hatred of women. If you want a single, solid reason why someone might dislike this series, then I hold this accusation up. A deliberate indictment of the game having values that hate women, and the implication that they cause the hatred of women.
Since what we're really talking about here are depictions of violence against women, it might be useful to quickly define what I mean by that term. When I say violence against women, I'm primarily referring to images of women being victimized, or when violence is linked specifically to a character's gender or sexuality. Female characters who happen to be involved in violent or combat situations on relatively equal footing with their opponents are typically exempt from this category because they're not usually framed as victims. As I mentioned in our last video, the damsel in distress doesn't always have to be accompanied by a heroic rescue.
Gendering violence again. Ignoring that males can be put through the same tropes, but somehow this is only noteworthy if it involves women. Also, given how she later says story and context aren't important, then why can we dismiss fighting games on these terms, but not games with stronger stories?
Here I was again, with all hell breaking loose around me, standing over another dead girl I had been trying to protect.
Sometimes the hero fails to save the woman in question, either because he arrives too late, or because, surprise twist, she's been dead the whole time. Or in the case of the 2009 version of Bionic Commando, not only has your wife been dead the whole time, but turns out she's actually a part of your bionic arm.
I never want you to be involved in this.
It's okay. I'll always be by your side.
Yes, you heard that correctly. His wife is his arm.
Bionic Commando. Yeah, that's stupid as hell. Take a look around. See how most gamers thought this was stupid as well. This from a perfectly fine side-scroller where you were supposed to rescue Super Joe from the Nazis and kill a Hitler clone.
But the most extreme and gruesome variant of this trend is when developers combine the damsel in distress with the mercy killing. This usually happens when the player character must murder the woman in peril for her own good. I like to call this happy little gem the euthanized damsel. Typically, the damsel has been mutilated or deformed in some way by the villain, and the only option left of the hero is to put her out of her misery himself.
Again, Anita ignores existing tropes that aren't hard to find. This one is called I Can't Self-Terminate, and she's mixed it, appropriately, with transformation horror, and transformation of the possessed, mercy kill, and better to die than to be killed. If you can't think of an example of these happening to a guy, then you either have a really bad memory or a seriously limited amount of exposure to media. Mass Effect presents this option on indoctrinated Solarian troops. In Saints Row 2, you kill the keyhauled Carlos. In Eternal Darkness, Paul kills Anthony. BioShock 2, Gil Alexander leaves a message for anyone to kill the monster he's becoming. This is not a trope about women, and making it so is about unfairly vilifying the trope, and the larger narrative of this is to unfairly vilify games.
A particularly egregious example can be found in Grand Theft Auto 3, when after you've rescued Maria Latour, it's implied that the protagonist suddenly shoots her because she's talking about stereotypically girly things.
I broke a nail and my hair is ruined! friend. I mean, can you believe it? This one cost me $50.
The writers deliberately wrote her character to annoy the player, so in the end, the violence against her becomes the punchline of a cheap misogynist joke.
This is an outright false claim. This is not an example of the mercy kill, and again she calls it woman-hating. Note that misogyny is not the hating of a woman, but the hatred of most or all women. Expanding the hatred of an individual into the hatred of some class they are a part of is the height of vilification and intellectual dishonesty. However, she is correct that the character was so annoying that the killing of her was the punchline to a cheap joke that I can understand finding offensive.
Sometimes these killings happen via cutscene, while other games ask the player to participate directly by pulling the trigger themselves. The captured women in Duke Nukem 3D beg you to kill them throughout the game. This misogynist scene is regurgitated and actually made worse in the 2011 follow-up, Duke Nukem Forever, developed by Gearbox.
Let's interrupt this particular segment to once again point out the use of the word misogynist. Let's note that if this Duke Nukem scenario involved men, it would not be accused of man-hating, and images of violence against women do not inherently equal showing or indulging in a hatred of women. A misogynist would enjoy these particular segments, but a racist who hates white men, Germans, or Islamics will gain a visceral thrill by playing the majority of AAA action titles. This does not, in and of itself, prove a problem with these titles. These inappropriate uses of terms like misogyny create a stronger reaction in people by leveling accusations against the subject that will make it easier for an audience to find the subject even more offensive or vile than it would possibly be without the attachment of such emotionally charged terms, regardless of their accuracy. You want a trigger warning? Put it on misogyny.
Help me! I'm so afraid!
In the 2006 shooter Prey, when the hero finally reaches his abducted girlfriend, she's been hideously mutilated and fused with a monster, which you must fight while she screams for help over and over again.
Get away from me, Tommy! She wants me to kill you! I can't stop it!
After being incapacitated, she begs you to kill her.
Please, Tommy. Let me go.
And the player can't advance in the narrative until you shoot her in the face.
Let me note that forcing a player to take an emotionally hard action themselves, rather than in a cutscene, makes the scene more powerful. And we'll also note that if we thought of these women as objects, then there would be no emotional value in killing them greater than being upset that you have lost an object that you valued. This would make an emotional reaction to these things that of a child upset at the loss of their favorite toy and in need of an adult to guide them.
These damseled women are written so as to subordinate themselves to men. They submissively accept their grisly fate and will often beg the player to perform violence on them, giving men direct and total control over whether they live or die, even saying thank you with their dying breath. In other words, these women are asking for it, quite literally. The euthanized damsel is the darkest and edgiest of these trope hybrids, but it's also an extension of a larger pattern in gaming narratives where male protagonists are forced to fight their own loved ones who have been possessed or brainwashed by villains.
Once again, Anita ignores existing tropes in favor of using the most emotionally charged terms she can. Although this does hit upon a number of tropes, these being transformation of the possessed, I cannot self-terminate, and the mercy kill. Before we let Anita continue on this one, I'm actually going to bring up an example of my own, of this selection of tropes that I found very powerful. It's from Fable 3. Say what you will of the gameplay, but one of the things that made the game for me were the main characters, and this is related to the character of Walter. Walter is an old soldier and a very important character in the story of Fable 3. In a war he fought in, he was trapped in a cave with 2 other soldiers for 3 days with no room and no light. He emerged from this traumatized by the experience and having a phobia of the dark, caves, and confined spaces. However, in the face of these things, despite his irrational fears, he never falters. He always does what he has to do to go on and keep the player character going on as well. He routinely faces down his own personal and visceral horrors because it is what he must do. Now, spoiling the plot, at one point in the game, Walter and the player discover a ruin housing a living darkness capable of infesting or destroying life. It takes Walter, and the player must rescue him from it. After this incident, the darkness is still living in Walter, and he still does not falter. A living embodiment of all his irrational fears plagues him from this moment forward, and he has the will and resolve to continue because he believes he is still needed. In the final battle with the darkness, Walter loses. The darkness takes full control of his body, forcing the player to kill him, and his final words are to comfort the hero. Writing this script, I just rewatched the scene, and I teared up at it. To say that Walter is giving up control is awful. To use the term asking for it, which is explicitly meant to be a phrase of justification that abusers use on their victims, an abuser of any gender or sexual orientation, as a way to damn a scene like this is heartless. And the very idea that a good actress playing a female version of Walter in this game would render it some awful scene about violence against, the disempowerment of, and glorifying the abuse of women is a reduction of women so harsh and nearly obscene that it beggars belief that someone could say it and still be considered respectful of women.
Although the narratives all differ slightly, the core element remains the same. In each case, violence is used to bring these women back to their senses. These stories conjure up supernatural situations in which domestic violence perpetrated by men against women who have lost control of themselves not only appears justified, but is presented as an altruistic act done for the woman's own good.
Here we have the words of abusers forced into stories that are not about abuse. Violence? Yes. Abuse? No. And most certainly not the kind of domestic abuse that she was asking for it. And bringing a woman who has lost control of herself back to her senses implies? No. Once again, these are fallacious terms used to give a false negative emotional charge to these scenes by invoking the horrors of unrelated domestic violence.
Of course, if you look at any of these games in isolation, you'll be able to find incidental narrative circumstances that can be used to explain away the inclusion of violence against women as a plot device. But just because a particular event might make sense within the internal logic of a fictional narrative, that doesn't in and of itself justify its use. Games don't exist in a vacuum, and therefore can't be divorced from the larger cultural context of the real world.
This here is the most intellectually dishonest thing that Anita says in this video. This serves only to try and take away the one method one has of countering her claims. Context of the story, characters, and situations they are in is the only thing that can inform what these portrayals mean, and later in this video she actually says the opposite of this, which should highlight how much of a disarming tactic this is, rather than a genuinely held viewpoint.
It's especially troubling in light of the serious, real-life epidemic of violence against women facing the female population on this planet. Every 9 seconds, a woman is assaulted or beaten in the United States, and on average, more than 3 women are murdered by their boyfriends, husbands, or ex-partners every single day. Research consistently shows that people of all genders tend to buy into the myth that women are the ones to blame for the violence men perpetrate against them. In the same vein, abusive men consistently state that their female targets deserved it, wanted it, or were asking for it.
Well, there's the direct correlation of abuse she's been setting up. Her unfounded statement of what's going on and what these scenes mean finally drawn into the direct comparison with domestic violence. However, we have numbers to deal with here, and to do this anywhere near properly is going to take a bit of time. First, the figure of a woman being assaulted, which includes being beaten without it being a separate category every 9 seconds. Since the website she references doesn't point to any kind of study or data at all, I can't check their numbers. Even if you can estimate the number of abusive relationships in the US, how can you estimate the frequency violence occurs in these relationships? After all, not all abusive relationships involve physical violence. What I did find was the violent crime data from the FBI as recently as 2011 through 2013. The data in question is for arrests, not convictions. The data is just for arrests for violent crime, which includes assault. The other set of data is for estimated violent crimes committed, which does not include regular assault, but does include murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Since the estimate for violent crimes is an estimate from supposed experts of unreported crime, let us work from the arrest numbers as they include more types of crime. So 521,196 arrests a year is 1,428 per day, 59.50 per hour, about 1 per minute, about 0.0165 per second, and 0.15 per 9 seconds. To reach one person arrested for violence every 9 seconds, you have to multiply this number 6.7 times, even if you presume that most of these would be for violence against women, and about 10% against men, you would need to multiply this number by 7.4. If you go up to an equal gender split, the multiplier is 10. This means to have one person subject to violent crime every 9 seconds, there have to be around 3,850,000 to 5,250,000 violent crimes unreported every year. You need a fair amount of solid evidence to support this level of unreported crime, much less making it all violence against women. Let us also note that even with the recently expanded definition of sexual assault, violent crime rates are still going down per year. Next, the murder rates per day and who commits them. The FBI's latest information is from 2011, and the table we want is the expanded homicide data table 10. Murder circumstances by relationship. Other than felony is where we want to look. If we tally up the numbers of wife, mother, daughter, sister, and girlfriend, we find that 1,057 murdered women were discovered in 2011. This actually does fit the claim that 3 women are murdered by an intimate acquaintance per day. However, if we add up husband, father, son, brother, and boyfriend, we find that 574 men are murdered in the same circumstances. Women successfully kill men close to half as often as men successfully kill women. 4.5 men and women are killed this way every day. Given the idea that most games don't depict women killing men, how much of an impact on these figures could the games that even involve men killing women have? Which is not the majority of violent games in the first place. One final note on the number of murders in the U.S. that these domestic violence figures do not cover. In 2012, there were 12,765 murder victims found. 77.7% of them were men. So 9,918 men were murdered in 2012 versus 2,846 women murdered in the same year. And we're not done yet. The next thing to cover is the statement that most people believe that women deserve the violence brought against them. I don't have the data on my first point on this, but to my understanding, most people on either side of an abusive relationship will justify it to themselves with such rationalizations. If you look exclusively at those relationships, then that is what you will find. People caught in such unhealthy relationships cannot be fairly used to represent people who don't form such toxic relationships. But what I can do is look at the only source Anita has provided for this statement, a paper by Julia T. Wood that's titled The Normalization of Violence in Heterosexual Romantic Relationships, Women's Narratives of Love and Violence. This paper opens with a list of statistics from the FBI and private organizations. The first is from the mid-1980s, and the rest run from 1994 to 1997. Note that despite opening with a list of statistics, the paper, as illustrated by the title, is about narratives and books that seem to be about personal stories after the initial list. Out of the 60 references, I found only one that directly references an actual survey, although I may have missed something on the list. This survey is Violence Against Women, Estimates from a Redesigned Survey from the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Statistics in 1995. However, one of the books listed is from 1998 and references a survey not dated in the title from a National Violence Against Women survey from the CDC. Without these surveys to look at, I will not take these claims at face value. I do not have the resources or interest in chasing down 15 to 17-year-old information from the earlier years of public access and personal connections to the internet. The document itself is 13 years old and claims estimates that 95% of victims of domestic violence are women. Let's look at the most recent lifetime numbers in the latest CDC document on intimate partner and sexual violence survey from 2010. In tables 4.1 and 4.2, we get victim numbers by gender, and over 1/3 of the reported results are male victims. And they did not get enough data on male victims of rape to include it in these statistics. 105 million women versus 66.5 million men. Let's not forget the possibility that men are less likely to report being victims of abuse than women are. The only direct data referenced by this article itself is a DC Bureau of Justice report from 1992, 22 years out of date by now. The vast majority of the rest of the 60 citations are publications about domestic violence against women. There is no way I can conceivably check all these sources to verify what they report or what Anita says. However, I will suggest that these references rarely go outside of the situations of abuse other than women being the victims of abuse and provide little data on what female abusers say about their male victims. And the last point is that abusive men who say their victim deserved it, wanted it, or were asking for it. I did not find hard data on this point, but as a circumstantial source, let us look at the Women's Safe page on same-sex domestic violence. I encourage anyone watching this video to go and read that page themselves. To address the statement that most people think the woman has somehow deserved the abuse they receive, let us go to myth 12. Victims often provoke the violence done to them. They are asking for it. In same-sex relationships, male and male, female and female, the abuser wants the abuse to be the victim's fault, regardless of the gender on either side of this equation. Attributing this as a male attitude is completely wrong and does little more than unjustly vilify men.
Given the reality of that larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them. Even though most of the games that we're talking about don't explicitly condone violence against women, nevertheless they trivialize and exploit female suffering as a way to ratchet up the emotional or sexual stakes for the player.
What larger cultural context? Virtually every context that's been provided has either been ancient, fallacious, or ignoring when men can be significant victims of the same issues. She has demonstrated nothing to support the statement that any display of violence in a video game is dangerous or irresponsible, and the claim of trivialization of violence applies more to men to such a degree that focusing on women is either myopic or agenda-driven. Stories try to ratchet up the emotional stakes for their audience. Yes, stories, the overwhelming majority of stories. However, where did this accusation of games ratcheting up the sexual stakes for the player come from? Sexual encounters in video games are even less frequent than violence deliberately aimed at women. If there will be no sex, nor even reward more arousing than the presence of the female, fully clothed or scantily clad in the game, then how is it even touching on sexual stakes?
Despite these troubling implications, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy.
Troubling implications. Let's just leave that one alone and focus on whether or not developers are trying to consciously misrepresent women here. She has made several accusations of misogyny against these games. To say these are not deliberate is to say that a large number of AAA developers that are unknowingly presenting content that indulges in the hatred of women. This seems like quite the claim. She also accuses them of deliberately using violence against women as a cheap tactic to fool their audience, which is an accusation of deliberation using women as a misleading device. This does not run directly counter to this statement, but after everything else that I've gone over, I feel that it's worth bringing up in relation to this statement.
Most probably just haven't given much thought to the underlying messages their games are sending, and in many cases, developers have backed themselves into a corner with their own game mechanics. When violence is the primary gameplay mechanic, and therefore the primary way that the player engages with the game world, it severely limits the options for problem solving. The player is then forced to use violence to deal with almost all situations because it's the only meaningful mechanic available, even if that means beating up or killing the women they're meant to love or care about.
Now here's where we get to an idea that breaks down to do not try and sell games your audience wants to play. The gaming industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and in the console market, the AAA titles that have the largest sales numbers, such a large profit margins that companies are willing to risk hundreds of millions of dollars, a large chunk of that in advertising alone, to make a game that will sell those numbers. Saying that developers have backed themselves into a corner is ludicrous. Even if companies were willing to sacrifice sales to make games that are more acceptable, the only thing that would happen would be other companies stepping in to fill the multi-billion-dollar hole that's been left wide open. To enable the creation of games that don't use violence, you must fund and support them outside of the AAA industry, and if the games are good and well received, you will be rewarded for them. Outside of the genre itself, the hidden object adventure games and casual non-violent games support a large number of releases every year. This is not to mention the large number of visual novels available, and a lot of them have no violence whatsoever. Big Fish Games alone, including the occasional guidebook, has 2,100 entries in hidden object games and 600 entries in mystery games. If Anita wanted to see games with complex characters and interactions at higher budgets, trying to change the AAA industry through such supposed critiques will never accomplish this. However, $160,000 might have made an awesome game or two.
One of the really insidious things about systemic and institutional sexism is that most often regressive attitudes and harmful gender stereotypes are maintained and perpetuated unintentionally. Likewise, engaging with these games is not going to magically transform players into raging sexists. We typically don't have a monkey-see, monkey-do direct cause and effect relationship with the media we consume. Cultural influence works in much more subtle and complicated ways. However, media narratives do have a powerful cultivation effect, helping to shape cultural attitudes and opinions. So when developers exploit sensationalized images of brutalized, mutilated, and victimized women over and over and over again, it tends to reinforce the dominant gender paradigm, which casts men as aggressive and commanding, and frames women as subordinate and dependent.
This entire section is built upon the ideas perpetuated by the concepts of the patriarchy and male privilege. What Anita is talking about is a society that makes men dominate and oppress women, and that those who deny this, men or women, are unknowing perpetrators of the patriarchy. These concepts are founded on gender feminist research, which is every bit as dishonest as creationist research, and addressing all the flaws in it are outside the scope of what I'm going to engage in. I don't have the resources or credentials to have or afford access to the materials alone, much less to take a proper look at the incredible number of books published on the topic and the data one would have to deal with.
Although these stories use female trauma as the catalyst to set the plot elements in motion, these are not stories about women. Nor are they concerned with the struggles of women navigating the mental, emotional, and physical ramifications of violence. Instead, these are strictly male-centered stories, in which, more often than not, the tragic damsels are just empty shells, whose deaths are depicted as far more meaningful than their lives. Generally, they're completely defined by their purity, innocence, kindness, beauty, or sensuality. In short, they're just symbols meant to invoke the essence of an artificial feminine ideal.
Once again, the large problem here is that Anita is looking solely at the AAA industry. Indie games aren't held to the same corporate standards, and with women being the largest audience for casual games, including hidden object and mystery titles, the main characters are very predominantly women. So yes, if you look at games made for men, you will find that the games feature stories mainly about men. However, if you look at the games made for women, you will find that the games feature stories mainly about women. And let us not forget the RPG industry, especially the traditional style Japanese titles. The player character is often male, but the large amount of average or better quality titles feature the other party characters with just as much personality, story, and importance as the player character has themselves, if not more.
In fact, these games usually frame the loss of the woman as something that has been unjustly taken from the male hero.
So now, I take from you.
Jackie, this is not your fault.
The implication being that she belonged to him, that she was his possession. Once wronged, the hero must go get his possessions back, or at least exact a heavy price for their loss. On the surface, victimized women are framed as the reason for the hero's torment. But if we dig a little deeper into the subtext, I'd argue that the true source of the pain stems from feelings of weakness and/or guilt over his failure to perform his socially prescribed patriarchal duty to protect his women and children.
Here we are. We finally get to a blatant invocation of the patriarchy. Let me note that nowhere in either the dictionary definition of patriarchy, nor from what I understand of the gender feminist definition, do they include a duty of protecting women and children. I'm pretty sure this behavior is prevalent in virtually every mammalian species. The only exceptions to protecting the females and children that I can think of is almost explicitly found in non-mammalian species. I pointed out this idea earlier in the video. I'll note that at the start of the video, she implies these concepts, and at this point after essentially prepping the viewer, she outright states them. The idea that the only emotional reason someone might care about a person is because they are his possession is an absurd reduction of the emotional capacity of a man. No possibility that he loves her and would give up anything, including his life, for her, or that he doesn't feel complete without her, or that he can't be a better person without her. No, the only possibility Anita offers us in the face of this tragic action is he has lost his possession. Anita already has the interpretation for you. She doesn't want you to think about the other possibilities, only the worst, most dehumanizing option for both the man and the woman in this scenario.
And I hated myself for allowing this to happen to her and our little girl.
In this way, these failed hero stories are really about the perceived loss of masculinity and then the quest to regain that masculinity, primarily by exerting dominance and control through the performance of violence on others.
Of course, this claim presumes that the man in question even cares about their perceived masculinity or feels that they lost any. If a woman were to go kill someone for revenge of their loved ones, are they on a quest to regain their lost feminism or their lost masculinity? This is an unbased value judgment following the larger theme of attributing the interpretation that Anita prefers onto the male characters, or any character.
Consequently, violent revenge-based narratives repeated ad nauseum can also be harmful to men because they help to further limit the possible responses men are allowed to have when faced with death or tragedy. This is unfortunate because interactive media has the potential to be a brilliant medium for people of all genders to explore difficult or painful subjects.
It has and does brilliantly explore these difficult and painful subjects. In fact, one of the most impressive, if downer games I can think of for exploring the feelings of desolation and loss is Winter Voices. I haven't finished the game, so I'm unsure if the combat in the game is, as presented, against spirits or a representation of the girl's trauma trying to make her give up. Given the huge number of hidden object and mystery games, I cannot begin to guess what numbers of them explore topics like these. However, I will again say that you cannot reduce the numbers of violent video games to try and favor games with more emotional and storytelling complexity. You can only drive the development of these games outside of the market demographic that provides and buys violent video games.
So to be clear here, the problem is not the fact that female characters die or suffer. Death touches all of our lives eventually, and as such, it's often an integral part of dramatic storytelling. To say that women could never die in stories would be absurd. But it's important to consider the ways that women's deaths are framed and examine how and why they're written.
And here we get the direct opposition to her earlier statement, and I quote, "Just because a particular event might make sense within the internal logic of a fictional narrative, that doesn't, in and of itself, justify its use. If Anita allows these deaths to be caused by violence, then she just put a lie to her earlier statement. If she did not put a lie to her earlier statement, the only result is that we cannot explore the death of a woman caused by violence in a video game. So which is it? Can we explore these themes based on the way the deaths are framed and written? Or is the only thing that actually matters the immediate cause of death?
There are some games that try to explore loss, death, and grief in more genuine or authentic ways that do not sensationalize or exploit victimized women. Dear Esther, Passage, and To the Moon are a few indie games that investigate these themes in creative, innovative, and sometimes beautiful ways. These more contemplative style games are a hopeful sign, but they're still largely the exception to the rule. A sizable chunk of the industry is still unfortunately trapped in the established pattern of building game narratives on the backs of brutalized female bodies.
So now we get to the games Anita approves of, which I would say bolsters my point. These games do exist, and existing, violent video games do not need to be removed to allow these games to be made and flourish. I didn't have an easy time finding the sales figures. However, I did find a statement that Dear Esther sold over 750,000 copies. If this isn't a resounding success, I don't know what is. The Passage is a casual game and doesn't even compete in the markets of AAA and indie titles. It's available for free on the creator's webpage, and you can get a copy from the iPhone App Store. To the Moon has not easily yielded sales data to me. However, it received a large amount of critical praise and has received over 10,000 positive reviews on Steam. This game has also likely been a resounding success.
Violence against women is a serious global epidemic. Therefore, attempts to address the issue in fictional contexts demands a considerable degree of respect, subtlety, and nuance. Women shouldn't be mere disposable objects or symbolic pawns in stories about men and their own struggles with patriarchal expectations and inadequacies.
This statement once again flies in the face of the data I can find, although I did not find direct data in this case. The World Life Expectancy site does have a nice representation of the deaths caused by violence in various countries. From peacealliance.org, the U.S. has 10 times the youth homicide rate of other leading industrialized nations, on par with the rates in developing countries and those experiencing rapid social and economic changes. There are many places in the world that experience incredible levels of violence, and there are most certainly countries where a lot and the worst of the violence is done against women. However, in the face of all the faulty claims that have been made, there is no reason to believe that there is a global epidemic of violence, especially when there are so many first world countries that do not have these problems. The use of characters in fiction in countries that do not experience high levels of violence or violence against women should not be held as some badly supported and overblown standard of those decrying only the things that are bad for women while ignoring the things that are bad for men. In a story, the characters should be what the author wants them to be, no more, no less. If the story or characters are done poorly, then most will decry the work for being bad. If they're done well, most will likely praise the work. If the author is proven to be pushing an undeniably bigoted, sexist, or racist piece of work, then a civilized society will at large likely condemn them. Although as there are bigots, sexists, and racists in real life, any work, no matter how bad, will find supporters. And let us once again note the use of the patriarchy.
The dark and edgy trope cocktails that we've discussed in this episode are not isolated incidents or obscure anomalies. Instead, they represent an ongoing, recurring pattern in modern gaming narratives. In most cases, the damsel characters have simply gone from being helpless to being dead, which is obviously not a huge improvement from her perspective.
In most cases of what? Video games? Examples you've presented? Video games from 2000 to 2010? Yeah, like the rest of the statements in this video, this one has no substance to it. Once again, just giving you Anita's viewpoint with no data whatsoever to validate her claim. And that's finally the end of this. I want to call it a train wreck, but it isn't. Like I said earlier, it's insidious. If this isn't deliberate and calculated, then you are witnessing one of the most incredible and happy accidents of delusion and natural talent. If what I've presented here is accurate, then the talents of these people are wasted on internet videos. They should be earning an obscene lifestyle supporting some oppressive regime with this level of manipulative ability. Although maybe marketing and communication degrees count on this kind of ability. I really don't know. On top of all this, it took me around 2 free days to do all the research I used in this video. I found tropes that were in the same categories Anita is harping on that she doesn't acknowledge or even seem to be aware of. I pursued her statistics to their sources and read their information. This cost me nothing but time. For a well-researched series, the only research apparent is gathering in-game footage, not researching the validity of anything she says. I don't see any good points Anita raised in here. Not when all of it's supported by old or faulty data, baseless assertions, and almost constant manipulation of her audience. Not when she accuses games, deliberate or otherwise, of normalizing abuse and enabling the oppression of women. If there are any good points in here, they are done a disservice by being brought up in the context of this video. I'm pretty sure I've demonstrated why I feel so strongly about tropes versus women, and hopefully I haven't painted myself as insane. To all of you that have followed me all the way through to the end, thank you very much for watching.